morning, everyone, and how blessed I feel. I feel right at home. I'm just, hopefully it's not inappropriate to say, but I grew up in the PNBC, but I feel like I'm welcomed in the NBC. Yeah, whenever President Kimber says, "Come on," that lets me know that I'm welcomed and I'm loved, and like him, I love him and I appreciate him, and I feel loved and I feel appreciated. Really excited to be with all of you. The truth of the matter is, whether we are PNBC, NBC, or whatever, we are all children of God at the end of the day, right? And that's who I am, a child of God. I want to thank you, President Kimber, for, first and foremost, for blessing me with a great night's sleep and for introducing me to the Heritage Spa. I emphasize spa. I guess it's the hotel and conference center, but for introducing me to this place. I am a golfer. I keep my golf clubs in my car because you never know when the weather is going to change. So I'm just, letting you know, Dr. Curtis. All good, all good. Again, so good to be with all of you and to share, my brothers and sisters in Christ. I want to talk to you about issues that are of great concern to us. I want to talk about some of the most critical issues that are facing us as a people. And what I want to do this morning is center our hearts and our minds on the challenges that persist in our communities, and together, thoughtfully and critically examine our roles as Christians and as members of God's church to address and ultimately overcome these challenges. So, President Kimber, Dr. Kimber shared with you that I am an attorney by training. I want you to appreciate that my perspective on these issues is informed by my work. First and foremost, it's informed by my faith. I consider myself a leader of faith. I head up the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which is a New York City-based social policy and advocacy organization that works to dismantle poverty-perpetuating policies and advance opportunity for those who've been marginalized and for too long oppressed. So my perspective is that of a leader of faith working on structural laws and institutional policies and programs in areas of racial justice, social policy, and criminal justice for more than 30 years. And also, as Dr. Kimber said, as the daughter of William Augustus Jones, Jr., who was a social justice theologian and pastor, having grown up under his tutelage and his watchful eye, as well as the watchful eye of Dr. Y.T. Walker, who I knew as Uncle Wyatt, and faith-rooted activists with whom my dad worked closely, like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. When you grow up in that kind of environment, you see the world in a certain way. And so I'm talking to you from that vantage point and that perspective. And what I'd want to do with you first is kind of like center us all in the same space. So I want you to, either, close your eyes as we kind of walk through a scenario, or just be with me and center with me. So here it is. It's a beautiful Sunday morning, the beginning of a sun-filled day. The scene, the front steps of a church situated right in the center of an impoverished community, a community with an abundance of problems. Broken down buildings and homes, abandoned lots, failing schools and undereducated children, high unemployment, the highest rates of maternal mortality, breast cancer, prostate cancer, hypertension, mental illness, HIV/AIDS, and other life-threatening diseases. Fathers and mothers, and boys and girls lost to drugs, lost to violence, and lost in the jails and prisons. You with me? It's early Sunday morning, and the streets are fairly empty, except for the churchgoers making their way to worship service. A beautiful, sleek car rolls up to the church. Can you see it? Car door opens, and the pastor steps out. Pastor makes his, maybe her, way to the church steps. And as they approach, eyes a homeless person laid out, sleeping not too far away. Pastor sees this, but he's got to get into church. So moves on into the church. And now it's worship time. Choir sings, ushers take up the offering, processing and recessing, pastor preaches, congregation erupts in praise, service ends, and everyone exits the edifice. But now the community is awake. As the doors to the church are locked, the kids in the street go hungry and move about aimlessly, some recklessly. Grown men and women, unemployed and undereducated, and some homeless, stand on the corners doing absolutely nothing. The pastor and the congregation can't help but see them. But they get back in their cars and they drive away to their comfortable homes. My brothers and sisters, do you see this? Is it hard to envision? Is it hard? Every Sunday, this is our reality. It's not hard to envision it because it's our reality. It's our local reality, it's our national reality, and in many places where our brothers and sisters live, far off places, it's the reality there as well. But how can this be? How? The church, the black church in particular, is the pillar of the community, right? Known for being there for the most vulnerable, for having pressed for jobs and fair wages and food and clothing. Some for having led the nation in securing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, affirmative action. So then how can it be that today, right on the steps of our churches, or not too far away, the homeless sleep, that right around the corner, children are being gunned down, both by other children and by the police. And we can't even get a justice in policing law, consistent convictions, or true accountability, even when we do get convictions. That children of color in lower income and racially segregated communities still cannot count on as good an education, a public school education, as children from wealthy and predominantly white communities, and our black children consequently continue to trail behind. How is it that black girls are disciplined in schools at 5 times the rate of white girls? That across this country, convenient access to quality health care is also tied to wealth and zip code, with our best hospitals in more affluent communities and our worst in the poorest. That 158 years since slavery was legally ended, our nation essentially captures and holds in mass incarceration African American adults at 6 times the rate of white adults, with 1 in 3 black men compared to 1 in 17 white men likely to be incarcerated. 1 in 3 black men likely to be incarcerated during his lifetime. How is it that over 6% of the African American population is disenfranchised, cannot vote, compared to 1.7% of the non-African population? And that just last year alone, in 2021, 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting, and more than 440 bills that would restrict voting access were introduced in 49 states. Not just the red states, 49 states. How is it that black men and women on average earn significantly less than white men and women, even when they have higher credentials? Do you know that a black woman with a master's degree on average earns a little less than $2,000 more than a white man with just a high school degree? And the racial wealth gap, you've heard this, continues to widen, with blacks on average having less than 1/10 of the wealth whites have. Black women whose bodies were the living and breathing cadavers for gynecological experimentation during and post-slavery today die at twice the rate of white women during pregnancy and childbirth. That people of a darker hue whose lives are in peril are denied asylum here in the United States in the present day by a president who was put into office by the people of a darker hue, while the doors of immigration swing open for others with whiter skin. I could go on and on and on. We could talk for the next hour plus. And I could give you stat after stat after stat. How is this? There are several reasons, but I'm going to center on structural and institutional racism and the role religion has played in its birth and perpetuation. In 1979, my father, William Augustus Jones Jr., as Dr. Kimber shared, published God in the Ghetto, in which he writes, "When sin becomes structured and inequity institutionalized, the resultant arrangement is ineluctably wicked and nefarious, for it denies others access to the tree of life. This is the continuing tragedy of America. The system is racist to the core, so deep and pervasive in the reality that its bitter fruits multiply even without cultivation." In God in the Ghetto, Jones provides critical insight into how structural and institutional racism came to be and how it persists today. He writes, "When the alienated and the afflicted," talking about us, "when the alienated and the afflicted speak of the system, the connotations are clear. They have engaged in serious scrutiny as a result of their own pain predicament and have concluded that their victimization is neither an accident of creation nor of history, but rather the result of a skillfully designed pattern of systematic exclusion from the mainstream of American culture. The system refers implicitly to the American trinity of capitalism, racism, and militarism. Capitalism is the economic system, erected on the damnable foundation of slave labor. It pyramided on cheap labor after the emancipation and now thrives on social stratification, which is racism made manifest. Racism serves to preserve and perpetuate the system. Militarism, the formula's third ingredient, has almost become a political necessity. It is not mere happenstance that the nation has known no real peace for more than 3 decades. Militarism saps the mental and physical energies of the nation's youth, those most capable of creatively confronting the evils of racism and capitalism." Now, Dad wrote that in 1979, and I add to that system today, militarization. The militarization, i.e. excessive use of policing and excessive use of force to essentially try to cause persons of color, the over-policing, over-surveillance, over-arresting of black and brown people in lower-income communities, militarization, using militarized tactics, essentially to push us into a state of submission, right? Because if we feel that we have voice, then like Nat Turner, we stand up and we speak out. What Dad was doing was speaking about critical race theory. We've been hearing a lot about critical race theory, about how structural and institutional racism were designed and implemented, all to produce perpetual and intergenerational inequality and inequity. Dad was talking about critical race theory long before the term was even created, and even longer before it was introduced last year into the mainstream race talks. We keep hearing a lot about this structural racism. And what I'm finding in critical race theory is that, I'm just going to put it out here, we're hearing about it, we're hearing about people trying to shut it down. But if you don't study this, you don't really know what they're talking about. Is that fair? We may be well-educated persons, well-informed, listening to the news, reading, but we don't necessarily know what this is. So if you all are okay, I'm going to take a few minutes to just help you appreciate what it is. Is that all right? Structural racism refers to the laws and systems that enable and make legal institutional racism in the form of rules, practices, and customs, which in turn produce or cause to occur inequity, disparity, and discrimination for blacks, indigenous, and other persons of color. Structural racism begins with law. The clearest and most irrefutable example was the 3/5 clause of the United States Constitution, which declared that enslaved persons would not be counted as whole persons, but rather that every 5 enslaved persons would be considered 3 persons. Now, while the intent of the Founding Fathers in making this declaration has been greatly debated, with arguments that the clause was not there to deny blacks human status, but rather to not allow for the South to have greater representation in Congress due to greater numbers of people, the fact remains that blacks were not considered whole persons. That's how it was written in the law. The facts are the facts. And that law, that first foundational law, then allowed for other institutional rules, practices, and customs to follow. After slavery was abolished, and even after the Constitution was amended to reduce the 3/5 clause, the institutional practice and custom of denying black persons the status of whole persons with rights and of legitimizing disparate treatment already had a strong hold. It was locked in, and the practice continues today. Here's a really striking example of structural and institutional racism. And you can see it in the design, the implementation, and the impact of what I'm about to share with you. The GI Bill, following World War II. The GI Bill, and it actually was an act, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but it became widely known as the GI Bill. This law provided that a range of benefits for some of those returning from World War II would be granted them. At face, what the GI Bill did was to provide for no-cost or low-cost mortgages and for payment of tuition to college and other schools to all U.S. military veterans of World War II. But in reality, only some were able to take advantage of it. The bill, the act, was racially discriminatory in its design against black Americans. Here's how. By design and then implementation and impact, what the law did was to buttress and reinforce inequities in access and outcomes. Colleges that were legally able to discriminate in denying admission to black persons, because this is before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's before affirmative action. Colleges that were legally able to discriminate in denying admission to black persons received tuition payments. But blacks couldn't take advantage of those programs. And the HBCUs that were getting them were already populated and filled with those who didn't go fight in the war. Through no fault of their own, black veterans missed out on a free education that likely would have increased their earnings, and in turn, their savings, and in turn, their family's wealth. You see? Design, implementation, impact. Additionally, the act provided low-cost and no-cost mortgages. But due to legal discrimination in housing and home purchasing, black persons couldn't purchase homes at the same level as white persons. And they couldn't purchase in many communities. And in the communities where they could purchase, remember redlining? The homes were redlined by banks and by the real estate community. And as such, they were deemed poor financial risks. And banks then were less likely to approve the loans and invest in these communities. And if they did approve them, they approved them at higher interest rates. Redlining diminished black families' home values and stifled equity growth. The long-term discriminatory impact of the GI Bill was foreseeable. Those legislators in Congress, looking like they were doing a good thing and taking care of everybody, they knew what they were doing. Whereas white veterans were able to buy homes, often in affluent or up-and-coming communities, because remember, they didn't have to put anything down or maybe just a pittance. They were able to do this with little to no money. They were able to go to college without any barriers at little to no cost. And in so doing, they unlocked the greatest contributors in our society to income building and to wealth building. College education and home ownership. The government knew blacks couldn't do this at the same level. White veterans were able to grow their income and their equity and in turn around and pour that into their families, setting their children up for their futures, taking money out of their homes when they built equity. Because remember, they buy the home, they don't put much down, so they got equity automatically. Now they can go to the bank because this is a good, this is a good neighborhood. The house is going to continue rising in terms of equity. They can go to the bank, pull out a low-cost loan for their child's college tuition. Black people, on the other hand, are in these red line communities. If to get a loan, they maybe had to put something down, so now their equity is not building. One, because they already had to put money down, but two, because the homes are not valued at the same level. Right? They didn't get their college education because they couldn't access the schools with no tuition, without having to pay tuition. And now their children don't have the benefits of their higher earnings, their any equity. So now they've got to turn around, and if they're trying to get ahead, what do? They have to take out loans. Today, we're now nearly like about 90 years since the GI Bill, a little less. The greatest contributors to wealth building in America, income generation, generating income, and home ownership are still far out of reach for Black Americans. All by design. You with me? One other example, I'll bring it home. Structural laws created harsher sentences for drug offenders. This, to me, is the most incredulous example. Possession of 1 ounce of crack cocaine got you the same penalty and punishment for 100 ounces of powder cocaine. Who was more likely to have an ounce of crack cocaine? And who more likely to be walking around with powder cocaine? And certainly not 100 ounces. The government knew what it was doing. And with the 3 strikes law, who went to prison most often for 3 offenses, sometimes for just possession, each 1 ounce of cocaine, for as many as 25 years? And who then was disproportionately denied job opportunities and housing and was disenfranchised if they were lucky to get out? Right? Which families, more often than not, could only depend upon 1 adult now for income because of possession of 1 ounce of cocaine, getting you many, many years in prison? Structural and institution racism. This is by design, implementation, and impact. And one last example, because I want you to hear this, because in order to do this work of speaking truth to power, you need to understand it. People will tell us it's just, we can't get ahead because we're not doing what we need to be doing. The system is designed to work against us. You hear me? One example that's rarely talked about, something called the federal poverty level. It's the measure that's used in this nation to help set wages and social policy. The federal poverty level here in the United States says that for a family of 4, traditional family, 2 adults and 2 children, living anywhere in the United States, the federal poverty level is just $26,500 for a family of 4. What does that mean? It means that the government is saying that a family of 4 that has $26,500 technically isn't poor. Where in the U.S. can one person, let alone a family of 4, live on an income of $26,500? Where can anyone cover rent, cover health care, cover food, cover transportation, cover child care? Right? Not in New York, where I'm from, and not in Connecticut. Right? But here's what happens. By setting the federal poverty level so low, the federal government is then able to suppress wages. and to prevent wage increases. Do you know that the federal minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour? Now here's what they do. They suppress that minimum wage, then they suppress wage increases, and then they use that federal poverty level to set the standard for who's going to get food stamps or food supports, who's going to get child care, who's going to get housing assistance, who's going to get cash assistance. Do you see what's happening? If a family of 4 with 2 adults earns the minimum wage of $7.25, for 2 adults, that gets annualized to about $30,000 a year. So what the federal government is saying, hey, 2 adults, 2 kids, you're making $30,000, you're above the federal poverty level. You don't really need a whole lot in cash. You don't need anything in child care. You don't really need a whole lot in housing support. Do you get what I'm getting at? Now keep in mind, if the black man is not in the house, and the stat today, sadly, nearly 70% of black households have the black woman, as the primary breadwinner and sole breadwinner. So stay with me. If the federal government says that if you're making, like $26,500 family of 4, $21,800 family of 3, 1 adult, 2 children. If mama's that 1 adult, 2 children, she's making minimum wage at $15,000 a year, $7.25 annualized. She's just $6,000 shy of poverty. Let's throw a little bit of child care money her way. Maybe we give her a little bit of housing. In New York City, in the Bronx, the most affordable borough, a mother with 2 young children needs $81,000 to make ends meet. You see that gap? That's what's happening all around the nation. And the nation knows that the black woman earns 64 cents on the dollar for what the white man earns. All of this works together. And ultimately what results? 1 in 4 black children lives in poverty today, compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. This is structural and institutional racism. And sometimes what I let people know is that we get caught up in racism and think we're dealing with racism alone. What Dad was helping me to appreciate, what critical race theory helps me to appreciate, when Dad wrote about the system of capitalism, militarism, and racism all working in concert, what he was helping us to appreciate is that racism is not our problem. Racism is actually the tool that this nation has figured out is very effective in ensuring that some people will have and others will not. Racism is the tool, but if you're not looking at how it works to perpetuate an unjust capitalist system, you're missing the point. So here's the deal. We've now endured a full 2 years of COVID. We're still wearing our masks. It continues. And we've seen all the devastation that it's brought upon our people, right? Disproportionately. And COVID, coupled with the continuing injustices I've just talked about, that pervade every pillar of our society, should be bringing us as believers of the gospel to an inflection point. You with me? Appreciating that our nation still has not wholly conceded its original sin and become what God desires, a society where all of God's children live as God intends. As a community of believers, as servant leaders called and commissioned to live out the gospel, the question for us is, what will we do? What does God command of us? Now, growing up the daughter of William Augustus Jones, I've often found myself wondering why more faith leaders aren't engaged in the practice of the revolutionary social gospel, as God desires and as Jesus taught and modeled. Indeed, many of us are running soup kitchens and food pantries, but most aren't doing the transformative work of social reform, working to change the systems, the structural laws and institutional policies and practices that make necessary food pantries, soup kitchens in the first place. Seeking to understand, I picked up and I read again my father's book, God in the Ghetto, a couple of years ago, in which he provides this seminal sociological, theological analysis of the system of racism, capitalism, and militarism operating in America with Christianity, a co-conspirator. You hear me? Christianity, a co-conspirator to keep people of color in an oppressed and destitute state. Like never before, I understood the inextricable link between racism, capitalism, and militarism, and how together they function like a well-oiled machine as the system to oppress, continually oppress people of color. What God in the Ghetto does is to serve up in an audacious manner, is that right? It's audacious and bold, a truth-telling of how the unholy matrimony of Christianity with racism, how Scripture was and continues to be twisted to allow for both slavery and the continuing injustices against blacks in all the years since. Jones writes in God in the Ghetto, a simple surface diagnosis of the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology emanating from a false theology. By way of an oppressive anthropomorphism, the racist creates God in their own image, and the creation eventuates in divine racism. Once the scheme is designed and developed, heaven is expected to honor it, angels are expected to applaud it, and white people are called into service by the eternal to promote and preserve it. Can I have that water? Actually, grab this. Thank you. Essentially, what Jones is positing is that once God was deemed by white men and women a white being, and God in the flesh, Christ, a white male, it became and still holds as the birthright and responsibility of those who liken themselves to look like God and be like God to keep people of color in an inferior state. In short, the racist theology portends that God is white and male and has decreed all others as inferior and less worthy or entitled to earthly riches and basic needs. But to suggest that, to act as though God intends that some of his children are not worthy of God's love and gifts would be a sin. Yes? What Jones does in God in the Ghetto is to help us appreciate how white supremacist thinking gets around this fallacious and incredulous interpretation of God's desires when Jones writes, the Christian gospel holds that to sin against any segment of the human family is to sin against God. To deny or even question another's personhood is sinful. To exclude on the basis of blackness is to call something evil, which God has already called good. Unless, of course, there's a dichotomy between blackness and humanness. If blacks are non-human or even subhuman, whites are guilty of no sin. You with me? So then how did the white Christian church, with slave masters, serving as pastors and as deacons, square slavery with biblical teaching? By declaring slaves property, chattel, and not human. If chattel, then they weren't violating biblical law. If chattel, they weren't calling evil what God had already deemed good. Excuse me. In short, in Jones's words, God is mobilized and made to serve man and his purposes, whether these purposes be economic prosperity, free enterprise, social reform, democracy, and so on. Racistic religion's ultimate feat is to relegate blacks to a subhuman category thereby allowing whites to marginalize and oppress them while claiming a guilt-free Christian identity. Daddy wrote, when stripped to a state of nudity, the racist ascribes to God a posture of partiality predicated on pigmentation, and then assigns to men their permanent places under the sun on the basis of pigmentation. So here's the deal. In reading God in the Ghetto, I grew to better understand the responsibility of Christians, specifically Christians belonging to the black church, whose theology is not that of the white supremacist, who falsely asserts that God has favorites, but rather of the true and living God who loves us all the same and who commands us to love one another. Our ancestors found in God the courage to reject the false theology of the slave master who twisted God's word to justify our enslavement. Our ancestors understood that we had to know God's word for ourselves. God doesn't have favorites, and God did not make people of a lighter hue to be masters over those of a darker hue. In God in the Ghetto, in reading it, I grew to better understand our role, our purpose as believers, to actively confront and dismantle the system. The erection of the black church was born out of necessity and became the place, the space, where we as a people found refuge, hope, and courage to press on. For many, it became the epicenter of fighting against racial injustice. In several communities still today, the black church and the faith leader is looked to be the crusader for us as a people. And in a world where structural and institutional racism and inequity abound still, and where the white church has not yet countered, the black church arguably remains our chief crusader. So what is the role of the black church today? Especially when we've got many people, young people, and most recent data has shown that even older blacks are now leaving our church. What does God command of us? Right? We witnessed with COVID that we were able to count on our black churches to feed the hungry, in some cases to provide shelter to those rendered homeless, to be charitable. The question is, can we be counted on to confront the systems that cause hunger and homelessness in the first place? To seek justice as God the revolutionary desires of his church and of his children. You know, sometimes we got, it seems like we're embracing the white evangelical notion of what Jesus intended when he said, the poor shall always be with you. Right? You know, we don't look back to the Old Testament and appreciate that Jesus was speaking from Deuteronomy and was talking about, how God was saying it is our responsibility to do all we can to make sure that our brothers and sisters go without. If you want to understand what God truly desires, sometimes you got to look back to the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament as well. But I'm reminded of Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Jeremiah 22:3. This is what the Lord says. Do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And do not shed innocent blood in this place. You with me? Proverbs 29:7. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Proverbs 31:8-9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Charity is social service, helping people make do. Justice is social change, helping ensure people do better. Charity provides basic needs like food, clothing, shelter to those who otherwise wouldn't have. Justice brings about social change in government structures and policies and in systems and institutions to help ensure that no one ever goes without. Charity is helping meet the need in the moment. Justice is addressing what caused the need in the first place. From the scriptures, it's clear that God intended both charity and justice. Dr. Jacqueline Thompson has a contemporary response in the book God in the Ghetto. And in it she writes, "The focus on charity without justice can bring long-term harm to both people and society, because lasting societal transformation never results from charity alone." In the spirit of God the revolutionary, charity and justice must be the Black church's responsibility. Charity and justice are what the Lord requires of us. For the church, that means feeding the food insecure, clothing those who can't afford to purchase the clothing on their own, and helping keep a roof over the heads of the homeless. But it also means challenging the very systems and structures that make that necessary in the first place. It means becoming a community where those who've been marginalized and oppressed because of racism and sexism and other isms are welcome, and being a community that actively challenges the laws, systems, and structures that allow and enable racism and other isms to persist. Charity and justice go hand in hand. It means speaking truth to power, just as Moses did, Esther did, and Daniel did. God is calling each of us to fight the systemic causes of poverty, conflict, and injustice, beginning with racism, to shift the mindset of good-hearted, well-intentioned do-gooders from being all about charity and little to nothing about justice, to being justice warriors as God desires and as Jesus modeled, to not just working to alleviate the burdens of the effects of poverty, but also working towards the eradication of poverty, not just helping those less fortunate and those made vulnerable to get by, but also helping them to get ahead. Not just advancing poverty relief programs, but dismantling poverty-perpetuating policies. In God in the Ghetto, Dr. Jones provides methods by which the Black church responded in years past and brought an end to injustice in powerful corporate institutions and in government. And 42 years later now, the book prophetically challenges us in the spirit of the social gospel to do the very same, to reconstruct a pathway out of enduring injustice with the community of the faithful, us leading the way. Last year, after much prodding from close friends and preachers, Freddie Haynes and Marvin McMickle, and a son in the ministry, Claiborne Lee, my family, we decided to re-release the book with contemporary responses from them and several others, Al Sharpton, William Barber, J. Alfred Smith, Jacqueline Thompson, people who are doing a lot of this work and who I knew and who knew some of my dad's work. We released this, and we also added sermons. We've now got 10 sermons in the book that really show how Dad preached the social gospel and how it should be applied in our everyday work. And the book's now titled God in the Ghetto, a Prophetic Word Revisited. What I'm hoping is that what the book will do is affirm and better equip us to be more like Jesus the revolutionary in the enduring quest for social justice, to better understand how God does his best work in the ghetto with those of us who know the ghetto, right? In the book, there's a sermon title, From the Mud Hut to the Big House, where essentially Dad breaks down how Moses was of the ghetto. God put him in Pharaoh's house, but then he returned to the ghetto and worked with his people, right? God does his best work in the ghetto, and that's where we are as a people. This contract of the ghetto was created by the white man, but it's where we are. It's where God is. God is calling us to do this work. What I will tell you is that after 2 years, after all that we've endured, the unfathomable losses that we all have experienced and witnessed, that each and every one of us is still here means that we have a purpose. We are not here just because God likes us. God has work for us to do. God has kept us to do kingdom's work. I once heard my dad preach, God did not save you for your sake. God saved you for the kingdom's sake. Kingdom's work is both charity and justice. And that is the work that we are here to do. I want to thank you, President Kimber, for gifting me this opportunity to share and to serve. And I want you to know that I am here. I lead the FPWA. We center on social justice and social policy, working with faith-based organizations. We're here to work and support however we best can. And we'll come on over here to Connecticut. We're just, 70 miles away? We'll come on over here and we'll help as best we can, because this is the work that God requires of us in this moment. Thank you.